The cafe smelled faintly of roasted coffee beans and fresh bread, the kind of scent that seemed to reach inside and wrap around your soul. There was warmth there, but not the kind that came from the heaters humming softly in the corners. It came from people, the quiet murmur of conversation, the soft laughter, the clinking of cups, the sound of life continuing in small, steady ways. Outside, the snow had begun to fall harder. It painted the city in a blanket of white, muffling car horns and footsteps, turning everything into soft silence. Inside, though, the cafe was its own little world, a place where time seemed to pause for those seeking refuge from the cold. At a corner table, Daniel Hayes sat alone. He always did. The same seat, the same window, the same cup of soup that grew cold before he ever touched it. His eyes, tired and distant, watched the snowflakes drift down through the glass. They blurred and melted into one another, like memories fading away. He wasn't here because he loved the food or the view. He came because this place reminded him of what peace used to feel like, before the accident, before the flashing lights and phone calls in the middle of the night, before his wife's car never made it past that icy intersection 2 winters ago. Since that day, silence had become his closest companion. It filled every room, every heartbeat, every morning. He stirred his spoon slowly, not really seeing it. Around him, life went on. Couples whispered over pastries, students typed furiously on laptops, and a barista laughed at some joke only she could hear. It was supposed to be just another lonely breakfast, another quiet morning blending into the next, until a soft voice broke through the noise. "Excuse me, can I sit here?" Daniel blinked, startled. Standing before him was a young woman, her coat dusted with snow. In her arms, she held a little boy, maybe 3 years old, with rosy cheeks and sleepy eyes. The woman looked nervous, almost apologetic. Her eyes were kind, but beneath them lay exhaustion, the deep kind that spoke of long nights and longer struggles. Daniel glanced around. There were other empty tables. "Why here? Please," she added quickly, clutching her son closer. It's warmer by the window." Her voice trembled as if she half expected him to say no. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. He wasn't used to company. But then, the little boy shivered and tucked his face into his mother's coat, and something inside him softened. "If you sit," Daniel said quietly, his tone gentle, "you have to eat too." The woman blinked in surprise, unsure how to respond. He gave a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "House rule." She nodded, grateful but embarrassed. "Thank you," she murmured, settling across from him. The boy climbed onto the seat beside her, rubbing his tiny hands together to warm them. The woman's name, he soon learned, was Grace Mitchell. She was 28, though the lines of fatigue around her eyes made her look older. Her son's name was Lucas, a bright little boy with a giggle that filled the space between them like sunlight. Grace didn't order food, only asked the waitress for a cup of warm water. When Daniel saw that, he silently pushed his plate of croissants toward her and gestured for another bowl of soup. "You don't have to," Grace began, her cheeks flushing red. "No one should be hungry," Daniel said simply. For a long moment, she stared at the steaming bowl before her. Then, with quiet gratitude, she broke off a small piece of bread and handed it to Lucas. The boy ate eagerly, crumbs scattering across the table. Grace smiled faintly, brushing them away. It was a tired smile, but it was real, and it stirred something deep in Daniel's chest, something he hadn't felt in years. As Lucas giggled, Daniel realized how long it had been since he'd heard a child's laugh so close. The sound was disarming, like a song he'd forgotten he loved. They ate in silence after that, broken only by the clinking of spoons and Lucas's happy chatter. Grace tried to keep her composure, but Daniel could see the cracks. How her hands trembled when she reached for her cup, how her eyes darted toward the window, as if searching for answers out there in the snow. When the soup was gone, she whispered, "Thank you, really. I'll pay you back someday." Daniel shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." What he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that this small moment, this fragile connection, had given him more than he could have asked for. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. As Grace stood to leave, Lucas yawned and leaned his head against her shoulder. She looked pale, almost dizzy. Daniel hesitated, then asked softly, "Do you have somewhere to go?" Her silence said enough. "I'll be fine," she said after a pause, forcing a smile. "I always find a way." He nodded slowly, watching her gather her things. "Take this," he said finally, sliding a few bills across the table. Grace's eyes widened. "Please, for dinner tonight." Her pride battled her need, but when she saw Lucas's sleepy face, she took the money with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. That night, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she'd held her son close. The way she looked at the food like it was both a blessing and a reminder of everything she'd lost. He told himself not to care, that she was just another stranger. But something about her lingered. Maybe it was her strength or the quiet courage in her eyes. Maybe it was the way she reminded him of everything he used to believe in before grief hollowed him out. The next morning, Daniel returned to the cafe. He told himself it was habit, that he liked the coffee here. But deep down he was hoping, against reason, that Grace might come back. And she did. When she walked in, snow melting from her scarf, Daniel felt his breath catch. She looked a little better today. Her hair tied neatly, her cheeks less pale. Lucas ran to the window and pressed his hands to the glass, laughing at the falling snow. "You came back," Daniel said quietly, unable to hide the relief in his voice. Grace smiled shyly and placed something on the table. "You left your scarf," she said. Daniel frowned slightly. He hadn't. Then he realized she was giving herself a reason to return, without admitting it. He smiled, touched by the small act. They sat together again. This time, conversation flowed easier. Grace told him about her old dreams, how she once wanted to study nursing, how life had other plans. Daniel listened quietly, occasionally offering words of encouragement between sips of coffee. The way she spoke, soft but steady, made him remember what hope used to sound like. Over the next few weeks, their paths kept crossing, sometimes by chance, sometimes not. The cafe became their quiet meeting place. Grace found part-time work at a daycare, while Daniel, an architect with his own firm, helped her fill out paperwork for government assistance. Lucas grew fond of him, calling him Mr. Dan, his mispronunciation always making Grace laugh. What began as a small act of kindness slowly turned into something else. Not romance at first, something gentler, something built on shared silence, mutual understanding, and the unspoken knowledge that both of them were still healing. One snowy morning, Daniel walked into the cafe and noticed Grace sitting alone by the window. Her hands were wrapped tightly around her coffee cup, her face pale, and her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The daycare where she worked had closed suddenly, and she didn't know how she would make rent this month. Lucas was a neighbor, blissfully unaware of the uncertainty surrounding their home. Daniel slid into the seat beside her. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He simply said quietly, "You don't have to fight alone." Grace looked at him, startled. "You've helped me enough already," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to fix my life." "I'm not trying to fix it," Daniel replied. "I just don't want you to face it by yourself." He paused, then added something she hadn't expected, an offer of a temporary job as his housekeeper. His home had been empty since his wife's passing, and he needed help keeping it in order. Grace hesitated at first. Pride war with necessity, but ultimately she agreed. Neither of them realized how profoundly this arrangement would change both their lives. Grace's presence brought life back into the house. Simple things. The smell of freshly baked bread, the sound of dishes clinking in the sink, Lucas laughing as he built towers with blocks, breathed warmth into spaces that had been silent for years. Daniel, who had shut himself off from the world after losing his wife, began to feel that warmth too, not the kind that erased grief, but the kind that made it bearable. One evening, while Grace washed dishes and Lucas constructed an elaborate tower of blocks, Daniel stood quietly in the doorway. The golden glow of the lamp softened the edges of the room. He watched them, hearing the gentle hum of life return, feeling a heartbeat in a home that had been too quiet for far too long. "Grace," he said finally, his voice trembling. "You and Lucas, you brought something back I thought was gone forever." She turned to him, her hands still wet from the sink, her eyes wide with surprise. Tears filled them before words could form. For the first time in years, Daniel reached out, not out of charity, but out of hope and a desire to share his life with someone who mattered. Slowly, gently, their lives began to intertwine. Grace found stability in Daniel's home. She discovered small joys she had forgotten she could feel. Cooking for someone who appreciated it, sharing laughter with a man who understood her struggles, and seeing Lucas's world expand in ways she hadn't thought possible. Daniel, in turn, discovered that life could still hold beauty. The walls of grief he had built began to crumble, replaced by quiet comfort, trust, and love nurtured through shared moments rather than grand gestures. Months passed. Winter thawed into spring. One bright morning, Grace and Daniel returned to the cafe where it all had begun. Lucas sat between them, happily munching on a croissant, his small hands covered in crumbs. Grace glanced out the window and smiled, catching Daniel's reflection in the glass. A playful thought crossed her mind. "Can I sit here?" she whispered, echoing that first day. Daniel chuckled softly. "Only if you eat too," he said, just as he had all those mornings ago. They laughed together, a sound filled with gratitude, memory, and quiet joy. What had begun as a simple act of kindness, one invitation to share a meal, had blossomed into a second chance at life, hope, and connection. Two broken lives have found each other in the most unassuming of places, rebuilding not through grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but through patience, empathy, and love nurtured in small, meaningful ways. Daniel looked at Grace and Lucas, the sun catching their faces through the cafe window, and felt a peace he hadn't believed possible. Life hadn't erased their pain, but in that moment, surrounded by warmth, laughter, and the faint smell of coffee and bread, he understood that some of life's greatest miracles came from the quietest acts of kindness. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, messy, and beautiful in its imperfection. It was a story of two people who had lost everything, only to find strength and love in the most unexpected of places. Slowly, gently, they healed together, and in doing so, they discovered that even after the coldest winters, warmth could always return. If this story touched your heart, remember, one small act of kindness, a meal shared, a hand offered, a "can I sit here?" can change the course of someone's life. It might not feel like much at the time, but it can create ripples that last far longer than we ever imagined.